Good evening, everyone. My name is Denis Stolyarov. I'm an assistant curator here at Pushkin House. And tonight, we are celebrating Teffi's 150th anniversary that happened last Saturday. And so Robert Chandler initiated this event a long time ago, and we knew that we wanted to have it. And of course, then the war started, but we decided not to not to postpone the event and not to cancel it, because it felt very relevant, and we just changed the format of the event a little bit. But Robert will tell you more. And I just wanted to say that we have another event with Robert in 2 weeks' time on 7th of June, and that will be a presentation of Alexander Pushkin's Peter the Great's African, and Robert will deliver a talk about Pushkin's role as a historian. So I strongly recommend you to book your ticket for that as well. So I'm not going to waste any more time. So Robert, please.
So good evening, everyone. It's lovely to see you all. Some of you helped me work on these translations many years ago. I recognize some faces. Teffi she died in 1952, 80 years ago, and she was born 150 years ago. I had dreamed of some sort of very stylish, glamorous celebration of all this. It doesn't feel like a time really for celebrating anything at present, but Teffi certainly deserves to be remembered. She is a writer who has been, probably more than any other writer I can think of, she has been very much pigeonholed. She initially became famous in Petersburg before the First World War for her kind of very witty, light, satirical sketches. And Russians have sort of never really seemed to have forgotten that. And she is widely thought of as a humorist, which is, totally inadequate. I mean, she is very funny, certainly, but a lot of her stories are very, very bleak indeed. And the first story I want to mention is from her 1916 book titled The Lifeless Beast. A lot of the stories are very, very painful stories about children, often children sort of being unloved and misunderstood. This particular story is called Yavdocha. It's about a peasant woman who really just cannot quite take in a letter that she is sent from the front line of the war. It's a notification of the death of her son. But she's illiterate, probably hardly understands what war is. She was criticized very, very sharply in the press at the time for mocking this peasant woman, which is the absolutely last thing that Teffi was doing. Teffi is portraying with great understanding this woman's total inability to understand what has happened. Teffi is one of rather few Russian writers who really did address the experience of the war. Obviously, Teffi didn't write a lot about frontline warfare, although she did work as a nurse herself. But anyway, this story is, I think, one of the finest responses I know to the First World War. I just want to read a very few lines from towards the end of the story. So this woman, Yevdokha, lives on her own. She's a kind of eccentric loner, lives a few miles from the nearest village. She's illiterate. The postman has brought her a letter, and the postman's illiterate too. She goes to the village to get someone to read the letter to her. There's a kind of half-hearted celebration going on of a marriage, or a marriage about to take place. So anyway, people are a bit reluctant to be bothered with her. She feels totally out of place. And finally, she gets a young man called Nicanor to read this letter to her. So he says, "Aye, it's a letter, all right. I'll read it to you. Auntie Yavdokha, I bow to you respectfully, wishing you good health. We're still going, still marching on. Very tired, but not too tired, mind. Your son, Apanasi, has gone to his rest. Maybe he were wounded, but don't get your hopes up, because he's gone to his rest. From Philip Mielnikov, who you know. That's all." "Philip?" asked the old woman, wanting to be sure. "Aye, Philip." She thought a little and asked, "Who's been wounded then?" "Philip." "I dunno, do I? Maybe Philip. Who knows? There's lots that's been killed. War, isn't it?" "Aye, war," she said. "Here, could thou read it again for us?" "I can't now. Come back on Sunday and I'll read it you then." "Right then. See thee Sunday." So then she leaves this hut, and another young man sort of bumps into her, asks what's up. And she says, "It's from our son, Panas. Sent us a letter from the army. Pilnit Melnikov's been wounded, or maybe he hasn't. There's lots that's been killed. War, isn't it?" In the evening, as she made her way back to her little hut, slipping now and then on the churned up, slimy track, she was thinking two thoughts, a sad thought and a calm thought. And I should interrupt at this moment to say that the one living creature in her life is a boar, a male pig, whom she's very fond of. And some soldiers have marched by the previous night and they trod down the nettles that the boar normally eats. So she was thinking two thoughts, a sad thought and a calm thought. The sad thought was, they've gone and trodden his nettles. And the calm thought, Panas sent us a letter, though. He'll send us money, too. Aye, and when it comes, I'll get us some bread, eh? And that was all. Several of the stories in that volume are to do with peasants, and she is a writer, although sort of seen as a sophisticated urban writer. She is one of the writers who've written about the Russian and Ukrainian, and especially Volhynian. It's a kind of area that has been contested between Ukraine and Poland in the past. She's written about the peasantry and their beliefs with great understanding. Teffi is a writer who got very much, she was immensely famous as a young woman in pre-revolutionary Petersburg. She was equally famous in the rather small world, the Russian emigre world, in Paris and elsewhere, the Russian diaspora. But the Russian emigre world in Paris was very isolated from the rest of Paris. So she didn't become, she was translated a little into French during her lifetime, but not to any great effect. Like a lot of emigre writers, she got very much forgotten after her death, because the whole sort of emigre Russian world seemed irrelevant after the Second World War. The Second World War kind of legitimized the Soviet Union and delegitimized the Russian emigre world. So even someone like her friend Bunin, who died shortly before her and who had won the Nobel Prize in the 1930s, I think about sort of 10 people attended his funeral. That world really did get forgotten. And it was only after several decades later that Teffi began to resurface. And it actually was very, very sort of striking how much she was resurfacing, because what is probably her best book, which is called Memories, Vaspominania. It's a book describing her last 6 months in the disintegrating Russian Empire. So it's a journey she makes from Moscow through what is crossing the border into what in fairly late 1918 is German-occupied Ukraine, and then to Odessa, and finally getting a boat from Novorossiysk to Istanbul. So it's our last 6 months in Russia and Ukraine. This book, which is, I think, utterly brilliant, is certainly the most vivid account of refugee experience that I know, with absolutely no overall coordination. There's no sort of dynamic Teffi estate coordinating things. It was translated, we translated into English, and French and German translators translated into their languages, all within a period of 2 or 3 years. That just happened entirely spontaneously. We weren't influencing one another. Just Teffi suddenly came to the surface at that point. Our English translation has influenced some other European countries. So there have been quite a few translations. I forget just which languages, certainly into Dutch and at least one of the Baltic languages. So it has become fairly well known since then. I wish that Teffi was more widely read in Russia itself. I mean, she gets republished a fair amount, but she's not sort of, she doesn't have the place she deserves on the school syllabuses. She doesn't get the scholarly attention she deserves. There's no, her work hasn't been there's no good scholarly complete edition of her work. There are still good pieces that she wrote in Paris, which haven't been republished ever in book form. So it's a joy to be reading from Memories to even on Zoom to Pushkin House, because we spent many, many evenings at Pushkin House with some of at least 2 people I've recognized on the little photograph, little screen, on those little bits on the screen at the top, who attended our translation evenings. She's a wonderful writer to for kind of translation discussion, because she writes with such delicacy and subtlety, and there are always so many subtleties that it's easy to overlook. And I always went home from these evenings with a lot of, I'd always brought along what I thought of as a fairly finished draft of a translated passage. And I always went back home with lots of improvements, and sometimes with bits that I really had seriously misunderstood first time round. So Teffi has an extraordinary gift for bringing together the tragic and the humorous, tragic and often the absurd. And here she is writing about her very last days in Moscow. So I'm reading from the New York edition of Memories, New York Review of Books. It's also published in this country by Pushkin Press. She mentions an operetta called Silva. Those last days were strange indeed. At night, we hurried past the dark houses, down streets where people were strangled and robbed. We hurried to listen to Silva, or else to sit in down-at-heel cafes packed with people in shabby coats that stank of wet dog. There we listened to young poets reading, or rather howling their own and one another's work. They sounded like hungry wolves. There was quite a vogue for these poets, and even the haughty Brusov would sometimes deign to introduce one of their evenings of Eros. Everyone wanted company, to be in the presence of other people. To be alone and at home was frightening. We had to know what was going on. We needed to keep hearing news of one another. Sometimes someone would disappear, and then it'd be almost impossible to find out what had happened to them. Had they gone to Kiev? Or to the place from which there was no return? So this is late 1918, I'll remind you. It was as if we were living in the tale about Zmei Gorenich, the dragon that required a yearly tribute of 12 fair maidens and 12 young men. One might well wonder how the people in this tale could have carried on, how they could have lived with the knowledge that a dragon would soon be devouring the finest of their children. During those last days in Moscow, however, we realized that they too had probably been rushing from one little theatre to another, or hurrying to buy themselves something from which to make a coat or a dress. There is nowhere a human being cannot live. With my own eyes, I've seen sailors taking a man out onto the ice in order to shoot him. And I've seen the condemned man hopping over puddles to keep his feet dry and turning up his collar to shield his chest from the wind. Those few steps were the last steps he would ever take, and instinctively he wanted to make them as comfortable as possible. We were no different. We bought ourselves some last scraps of fabric. We listened for the last time to the last operetta and the last exquisitely erotic verses. What did it matter whether the verses were good or terrible? all that mattered was not to know, not to be aware. We had to forget that we were being led onto the ice. So she eventually leaves Moscow. She's not initially intending to emigrate. She thinks she's just going to Odessa, which is at the time somewhere relatively comfortable, where there's plenty of food and where she will be doing some readings to earn money. So she spends time in Kiev on the way, then Odessa. She leaves it rather late to leave Odessa. And sorry, I'm having trouble finding the right page. So the boat on which she leaves Odessa eventually arrives in Novorossiysk. What an enormous port. Jetty after jetty, one after another. Cranes towered everywhere, like the necks of gigantic black water birds. And endless sheds, depots, warehouses. And people, crowds of people, all over the waterfront and the landing stages. At first I thought there were passengers waiting for a steamer. But after walking about a little, I soon saw that they weren't waiting there. They were living there. They had rigged up tents out of baskets and pieces of cloth, hung up their ragged things, and there they now lived. There were old women roasting scraps of food on braziers. And there were half-naked children playing with mutton bones and bits of broken bottles. Swarthy children with tousled black hair. In front of each tent stood a pole, and tied to this pole was a cluster or garland of garlic. These people were Armenian refugees. They had been in Novorossiysk for a long time and had no idea where they would be sent next. So I remind you, this is a few years after the genocide in Turkey of Armenians. They'd been in Novorossiysk for a long time and had no idea where they would be sent next. So where they would be sent, they're not in control of their own lives. There had been an outbreak of typhus in the city, and many of them were sick. Children were dying of fever. The clusters of garlic were there to ward off infection. Ghosts, vampires, werewolves, and a variety of diseases all strongly disliked the smell of garlic. As do I myself. I entirely understand these ghosts, vampires, and werewolves. These refugees were leading a strange life. They had been driven here from one place, and they would soon be driven on to some other place. Although all they owned in the world might be a few rags and a frying pan, they seemed to be finding their lives quite tolerable. I sensed neither despondency nor even impatience. They bickered, laughed, wandered through the camp to visit one another, and smacked their children. Some were even selling dried fish and pressed mutton. A boy was blowing on a clay whistle, and two little girls were dancing, their arms around each other. No one grumbled, worried, or asked too many questions. They accepted their present life as something quite normal. I saw one woman in a torn dress made from silk. Not long ago, she must have been rich. She was showing her neighbor how she'd stretched a shawl over a rope. She was very pleased with herself. And if the shawl had been a quarter, yes, just 1/4 as long again, she demonstrated several times with her palm how much more material she needed. Then she could have completed their tent. She was just that quarter of a shawl away from total comfort. It's true. Everything is relative. Her neighbor could not help feeling envy. She herself had only a garland of garlic with which to protect her home from vampires, disease, and prying eyes. So very similar to the passage about the soldier wanting to, the condemned man being taken out onto the ice and trying to avoid puddles to make his last steps more comfortable. So as I said, Teffi is remarkable for her lightness of touch, her grace. But it's clearer to me over the years that her lightness and grace is a way of trying to keep some deep pain at bay. And there are several of her stories that end with terrible cries of pain, rather unexpectedly. And I shall now read the very last page of Memories, which ends with one of these cries. Our last hours on the quayside, beside the steamer, the Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich. Hustle, bustle, much whispering. The strange whispering that, along with a constant looking back over the shoulder, had accompanied all our arrivals and departures as we slid down the map, down the huge green map, across which, slantwise, was written the Russian Empire. Yes, everyone is whispering. Everyone is looking back over their shoulder. Everyone is frightened, constantly frightened. And not until their dying day will they find peace, will they come to their senses. Amen. The steamer shudders, whipping up white foam with its propeller, spreading black smoke over the shoreline. And slowly, softly, the land slips away from us. Don't look at it. You must look ahead into the wide, free expanse of blue. But somehow the head turns back. Eyes are opening wide, and they keep looking. And everyone is silent, except for one woman. From the lower deck comes the sound of long, obstinate wails, interspersed with words of lament. Where have I heard such wails before? Yes, I remember. During the first year of the war, a grey-haired old woman was being taken down the street in a horse-drawn cab. Her hat had slipped back onto the nape of her neck. Her yellow cheeks were thin and drawn. Her toothless black mouth was hanging open, crying out in a long, tearless wail. Ah! Probably embarrassed by the disgraceful behavior of his passenger, the driver was urging his poor horse forward, whipping her on. Yes, my good man, you didn't think enough about whom you were picking up in your cab. And now you're stuck with this old woman. A terrible, black, tearless wail. A last wail. Over all of Russia, the whole of Russia. No stopping now. The steamer shudders, spreading black smoke. With my eyes now open so wide that the cold penetrates deep into them, I keep on looking. And I shall not move away. I've broken my vow. I've looked back. And like Lot's wife, I am frozen. I've turned into a pillar of salt forever. And I shall forever go on looking, seeing my own land slip softly, slowly, away from me. So that page gets more and more painful to read as the years go by. And we were first translating this book as the kind of war in Ukraine was beginning 8 years ago. We had little idea how terrible it was going to become, and how ever more relevant Teffi's writing becomes. And I want to just mention that among the members of the audience tonight whom I just glimpsed on screen is on screen, I think I said, on screen is Michel Biedi of the Moscow Times, a very, very gifted translator herself. And had this rather odd experience recently of I was being asked by an academic and one of the I forget which of the Ivy League universities on the east coast of the States, but they were in the first stages of compiling an anthology of Russian Constantinople, so the experience of Russian emigres in Constantinople in the first years after the revolution. Constantinople was where Teffi's boat from Novorossiysk sailed there. That was her first stop. And Teffi's first emigre publication was a little tiny book called Stambul i Solnce, Istanbul and the Sun. It's just a little collection of half a dozen sketches. And I was being asked to translate this, and I just had too many other things already scheduled. And I've always known I've long known how much Michel Verdi admires Teffi, and what a gifted translator she is. So I was very glad of the opportunity to pass this work on to Michel. This is kind of probably about, 5 months ago or so. And it was very, very strange indeed that Michel took this work on when she was still, or we were discussing this when she was still living in Moscow, and her life in Moscow seemed fairly stable. And then Michel was herself leaving Moscow in rather a desperate hurry, having left it rather too late, and leaving, the Moscow Times was clearly doing things in Moscow that were greatly contravening Pushkin's new laws. They were clearly guilty of supposedly criminal activity. So Michel left. She did flying. There were various options that she was considering for how to leave Moscow, together with her therapy dog, whom she greatly loves, and that made it rather difficult to made travel rather difficult. But traveling via Istanbul was one of the possibilities. In the event, she went by minibus to Tallinn via Riga, a small minibus with 6 adults, 3 dogs, and a mountain of luggage. So kind of odd, unexpected parallel between her own experience and Teffi's. So anyway, I'm glad to see Michel in the audience. As I said, I'm glad to see several people who came regularly to our Pushkin House evenings and helped to translate this book, which was very, very much of a collaborative effort. A great many people playing big or small part, making big or small contributions to it. And of course, I look forward to Michel's translation of the Istanbul sketches. So I think probably that's where I should stop and ask for questions. Michelle, do you want to say something? I can see something on the chat line.
Yes, thank you very much, Robert. And it was very funny after I wrote that piece for Politico. One of my very good friends called me up and he said, "You know what this reminds me of? It reminds me of Teffi as she's starting to leave Russia." And I thought, well, I guess I am destined to do this little translation. Very much. I also, well, we think a lot here about emigre life because, of course, it's one of the diasporas, and none of us ever expected to be in a diaspora. And none of us, I think, ever expected to be in the same kind of diaspora 110 years after the last one. Anyway, so I've been very much enjoying listening to you this evening and hope I do Teffi proud.
I don't doubt that for one thing. So thank you very much, Michelle. It's good to hear your voice.
I just wanted to say that as we are such a small crowd, if you have any comments or questions, please just switch on your microphone, and I hope it will go all right.
I'm looking at the chat, and Catherine Caro has written something about an article about Teffi in the New European Journal, which I don't know. Thank you, Catherine. Catherine's going to hold it up. Thank you very much for bringing this to our attention. Can you all see Catherine on screen? Is it possible to make Catherine more prominent? Yes, it is. Is this available online? Do you know?
I believe so. Yulia Kartalova-Doherty published the link in the chat to this very article.
Oh, yes, great. Thanks. Thank you very much, Catherine. Okay.
Catherine, if you want to say something, you'll need to unmute yourself. I think I can.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, Memories is featured. I had never heard of Teffi 10 days ago, and now I feel like I found a soulmate from another lifetime. And I've already bought 3 books, including yours. And I can't wait to start. And it was, quote, totally by accident that Dennis sent out the notification. I read about the lecture, and then I happened to pick up this newspaper, and there's nothing on the cover to say that this article was going to be on the inside. And so I'm just thrilled.
But thank you. Very much. And I am
going
struck.
to recommend our Pushkin House book. I was going to say I'm going to recommend to our Pushkin House book group. We meet once a month on Friday, first Friday of the month, and I definitely am going to recommend Memories as one of our possible options. But I also got subtly worried.
Thank you.
So, thank you.
I was struck by your use of the word.
Touched.
I was struck by your use of the word soulmate, because that is a very. She does have an extraordinary gift for creating a sense of intimacy with the reader, and quite a number of reviewers use that kind of language about her. Nick Lazard in The Guardian wrote, I think his review of Subtly Worded started off, Pushkin Press have done it again, made me fall in love with a writer I'd never heard of before.
I just can't believe there hasn't been a film about her, or an op, or a play, or maybe I'm just ignorant, and there has been, perhaps.
No, there hasn't.
Certainly.
I mean, a few people have been making noises about doing a film about her, but nothing has happened yet.
Well, I'm sure you'll be the consultant if that happens.
There is actually
now.
as well as this attention to translating Teffi into different languages, there has also recently been an excellent, very, very conscientious biography published in the States
Right, I
But-
saw that.
by
I saw that.
Edith Haber,
Um,
who has actually been working on Teffi for several decades. And I know that's been translated into Russian, it's been published in Russian. I don't know if it's been translated into any other languages, but so she's getting that attention too. But I would like to see a really good, complete Teffi, because she clearly did publish. She was a real pro. I mean, she published stories and sketches more or less weekly in different journals and newspapers throughout her life. I mean, she was making her living.
Irrepressible.
Sorry?
She was irrepressible.
Yeah, she
and
was.
Eccentric, yet such a passionate person with what she did with her life, and yet she was able to walk away from her own family for her art. Or that's just the brief things I've read.
No, I mean, this is no doubt probably the deepest of all the many pains in her life was which she kept very, very quiet about. She although she creates this sense of intimacy with the reader, she was actually a deeply, deeply private person. And she married very young, clearly disastrously. And after a few years and having given birth to three children, I think, and she left her husband and children. It was impossible, you know. She couldn't leave her husband and take her children. That just was not, you know, legally the woman left the family, the children stayed with their father. So the way she writes about it, the way she wrote, I mean, she reestablished quite a close relationship with, and certainly one of the daughters, maybe both the daughters later in her life. The way she writes about it, she just, as if she had no choice, that she would have cracked up completely. It would have been the end of her if she'd stayed with the family. So she left her husband and children to carry on living in whatever provincial town it was, and moved back to Petersburg, where she'd been brought up, and very quickly established herself as a professional writer.
Robert, so, I wanted to ask a question. Why do you think Teffi is not more well known? Is there a particular reason?
A mixture of reasons. General, you know, the fact that the emigre world was completely forgotten for several decades. The fact that she's got pigeonholed as a light humorist. The fact of her being a woman obviously counted against her in the past. I mean, that's no longer the case. But I was struck when I first translated her for an anthology of short stories I was doing for Penguin Classics, an anthology of Russian short stories. And I was asking, you know, I enjoyed the opportunity. It was sort of a good thing to talk about with virtually anyone I met who was either Russian or with any interest in Russia. And I would ask them what were their favorite short stories, what writers would they be including if they were doing such an anthology. And Teffi was one of the writers who most divided opinion. Some people were passionate that I should include. Other people were criticizing me, thinking I was just trying to sort of introduce a token woman and, a few more token women into the anthology, and so on. And, why was I bothering with such a lightweight writer? I think on the whole, well, I have sometimes had the thought that, how tragic it is that Russians don't value so much of what is important to their own culture. What if Russians valued their own culture more? Might they feel less need to start trying to conquer more territory? And there are quite a lot of huge gaps, I feel, in Russians' knowledge of their own most important cultural achievements of the last century. So to take a completely different example, Pavel Filonov is, to my mind, one of the very, very greatest 20th century artists. Certainly, I think he's a greater artist than Malevich or Goncharova or any of his contemporaries. It's clear enough why he was slow to become known, because he being a dedicated socialist, he left all his paintings to the Russian Museum in Petersburg, and because his art is so unusual and so far away from socialist realism, the Russian Museum just hid it away in their cellars for decades, so it didn't emerge from their cellars till the late 80s. But in any other country, there'd be a Filonov museum in Petersburg. As it is, they give him a room. They put on at least a couple of big exhibitions over the years, but their permanent collection just has about 9 or 10 paintings of his in a single room. They're great paintings, but the world's art experts, haven't all been rushing to Petersburg all the time. He's still rather little known, both internationally and in Russia itself. And there are Picasso museums all over the place. Anywhere where Picasso spent time, there's a Picasso museum. But Filonov is barely known at all. Grossman's work is little read in Russia itself, although widely known in the rest of Europe and throughout the world, really. So there are quite a few very great Russian artists and writers who haven't yet been appreciated the way they deserve in Russia itself. Is it Adam raising his hand?
Yes. I just wanted to ask, I was thinking, you were speaking about Filonov and Grossman. Is there anything in particular that do you think might sort of unite these sort of Russian artists and writers who so far have been neglected in their homeland? Is it any useful generalization one could make, do you think?
I doubt it. I don't think Platonov and Grossman were actually very close to one another, so they were friends, and late Grossman clearly does bear some of Platonov's influence. But Teffi is a very, very different writer.
True.
I think it's just a kind of laziness, really, a kind of sticking to conventional opinions.
I just wonder, thinking of what you're saying about Teffi and her sort of the delicacy and the way she can really sort of get down to those very awkward sort of emotional sort of places, seemingly so quickly. I'm just thinking about again the story we did in the workshop I came to, is just how dark that is, and how you have that sensation of getting to this inmost sort of experience of Katya's feelings so quickly, and you're not quite sure how you got there, not always, and there's that sort of deftness, if you like, where there's something about that sort of is difficult, is easy to miss. Whether there's something about that.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I love all that you say. I like the use of the word deftness, and the kind of unexpectedness with which one gets into very dark places. I certainly do nearly always underestimate her stories first time round. I was saying just before we began, I was saying to Dennis how I've sometimes been shocked at looking at notes I've made after first reading a story. There's one story against which I'd written sentimental. It was anything but. So sometimes it hasn't been until I actually started translating a story that I realized quite how fine it was. And certainly, we've been step by step coming to realize her greatness over the years. So we did just a couple of stories that we included in for Penguin Classics in Russian short stories from Pushkin to Buddha. Then we included a slightly larger number of stories in a book of Russian magic tales from Pushkin to Platonov. And at each step, I was sort of gradually realizing that this is a writer who I was coming to admire more and more.
Isn't that the wonderful thing about translation? It's that sort of just the way that you read your way into things so sort of profoundly. At least I find, from my limited experience. But
yes, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Or what is your own experience?
Well, it's the one, because Yulia said tonight, as well as we're translating Tsvetaeva's essay on Natalia Goncharova, which is a challenge of a quite different kind, I think, but it's but fascinating. I mean, I think one of those things of which I would certainly say, it found me rather than I found it. Having sort of come across the text, and then I sort of began to read. I had no thought of sort of doing anything with it, sort of translation-wise or anything. But I just kept coming back to it, and indeed, in general, to Tsvetaeva's sort of late prose style. So
Tsvetaeva's prose is wonderful. I mean,
it's tremendous.
I love what she wrote about Pushkin. I haven't read her Goncharova essay.
Yes, it's a funny sort of halfway house, I think, but it's on the way to those late essays like «Искусство при свете совести» or «Апоси лирика в современной России». I mean, the only one that's it's biographical, like a lot of the earlier 20 essays, essays of the 20s are. But it's an interesting sort of stepping stone, I suppose.
Thank you. And perhaps that's an opportunity to mention that Teffi, I mean, Tsvetaeva's prose is wonderful. And although she clearly is primarily a poet, but there are a great many of the finest 20th century Russian prose writers who either began as poets or continued writing as poets throughout their lives. So Bunin is one. Platonov's first published book was poetry. Teffi continued writing poetry throughout her career. Her poetry isn't as great as her prose, but her prose is kind of informed by her experience as a poet. There's a kind of a delicacy and attentiveness to rhythm and wordplay that is that of a poet. Really, yes, I mean, Nabokov, another poet, come prose writer. The great prose writers who didn't write poetry, like Grossman, are probably almost a minority. Even Solzhenitsyn wrote some poetry. And Shalamov is a very, very great poet. He attached at least as much importance to his poetry as to his prose. And I think his poetry is actually neglected. Some of his poetry is very fine indeed.
If nobody has any questions, I wanted to thank
Pasternak, yes, of course. Sorry, I'm getting tired, so I'm kind of forgetting to say the obvious things. Pasternak is a poet and prose writer. Thank you, Catherine. Sorry, carry on, Dennis.
Oh no, I just made, a stop. Maybe somebody wanted to say something else. But if it is not the case, I just wanted to thank you, Robert, for delivering such a beautiful presentation and commemorating Teffi as she should be. And I wanted to thank everybody for being here tonight with us. And I just wanted to say once again, and I'm going to put the link in the chat, that I hope to see everyone again with Robert in 2 weeks for the next celebration, that time of Alexander Pushkin's birthday, and to hear you speak more about Russian poetry.
And thank you all very much for your contributions. This has been one of the kind of probably of the different Zoom events I've done over the last year or two, the one that has had the most sort of lively discussion afterwards. So thank you very, very much indeed, all of you. And thank you, Dennis, and everyone at Pushkin House. Okay, bye for now.
Have a nice evening, everyone.